Start the conversation between us. I mean, maybe Madison and Nidhi, you could give us some sort of background in terms of the motivation and impetus for creating the EdTech Equity Project. I don't know who wants to go first, but maybe just start there and give us a kind of general overview.
So in 2019, Nidhi and I worlds collided or crossed paths at the Aspen Institute. We were fellows in the Aspen Tech Policy Hub, which is a program that is designed to teach technologists all about the policy process, but specifically, how do you develop policy solutions with a technical view to solve challenges and problems that we see in the world. And so in that program, we came together and started having a lot of conversations about our backgrounds, where we come from, and we found a couple of parallels. One was that both Nidhi and I are women of color who've lived most of our lives in the United States and participated in the public school system in America and had lots of things to say about that. We also had a deep interest in artificial intelligence and its applications with regards to equity. And we really cared about education and both had formally worked in some form or fashion in the education space. And so we started to do research on how did all of these particular things intersect through the lens of technology policy and how artificial intelligence was being used in EdTech products. And then I'll kick it over to Nidhi to keep the story going.
Thanks, Madison. Yeah, to build on that, I think one of the things that we had realized is that there was a ton of conversation happening around race and technology, around technology and education, and also around race and education. But very rarely were all three of those topics being talked about together. And what we found was obstructing the ability for those conversations to happen is that stakeholders in each of those different places, so whether it be educators, students and families, EdTech companies, VCs, were speaking different languages. And so those conversations weren't happening in a way that gave everyone who should have a seat at the table a seat at the table. And so Madison and I started thinking about what could we create that would enable those conversations to happen, to decrease the friction. And in particular, in our work, what we understood was we would often come across EdTech companies that had really good intentions and wanted to build things that that impacted student outcomes in a very positive way, but lacked an understanding of what was actually happening in the classroom or the experiences of Black and Brown students in particular, or students who have been systemically marginalized in their regions. And we also heard from school leaders or from teachers and parents, that they had a fear around how to have conversations about artificial intelligence and how the technology was impacting students because they didn't feel like they were AI experts. And so we created two toolkits as the EdTech Equity Project. One was a toolkit for EdTech companies to help companies understand, when you take the traditional design and development process that companies undergo, where along that process should you be thinking about racial equity? Where can you sort of take really tangible steps to shift your processes and practices within your company to prioritize racial equity from the start? And then we also created a rubric for school leaders, for procurement officers, that gave them just a set of simple questions that they could ask EdTech companies that they were working with to get a sense for and score them red, yellow, green across those categories around how they were thinking about and prioritizing racial equity in their process. Again, that doesn't mean that companies are bad. It just means that they may or may not have been designed with that school's students in mind. And so that was sort of the start of Madison and my work together. We really wanted to move this conversation forward. And then fast forward to working with Digital Promise on turning that toolkit into a certification as a way to signal to the market which companies were really thinking about racial equity, for which companies was that top of mind and really baked into their process. And we're excited to talk more about that.
Why do you think that disconnect was there in the first place? I mean, that's quite a big question to ask, but I'm kind of interested to know your views on why that disconnect happened, particularly between kind of practitioners who will have been on a kind of day-to-day basis aware of the racial inequity issue in education, and then the EdTech companies sitting outside of that and not thinking, or maybe not thinking about it carefully enough.
I have a couple thoughts from my own experience, and then I'll kick it off to Madison and would be very curious to hear SoapBox Labs perspective as well. I think that a couple things. The first is that we often have folks building technology who had a very particular lived experience in education, access to certain types of learning environments that are different than the reality for a lot of children in public schools around the world. And you build for what you know. It doesn't make you a bad person. It's just what's natural. And so I think that it doesn't tend to be the natural course of developing technology to kind of step outside of your own experience and be curious about and spend time and money effectively in understanding the different experiences that are happening in the classroom. The second piece, I think, is the fear around tracking race in recording race data or other factors that tend to be correlated with race. And we often heard when talking with EdTech companies that they didn't record racial data because they wanted to be respectful of students' privacy. That is, of course, important, but we know, and would love to get into that a little bit, how important it is to be aware of how your products are impacting students across different race or ethnicities. And then I think the third piece is just that we, in these places, practitioners and EdTech companies, again, speak a very different language. And so oftentimes, even when, as an EdTech company, you're doing your best to try to engage with schools and learn from and learn with and build with them, some of these conversations just don't happen because schools aren't even aware of the questions that they need to be asking. And similarly, vice versa, EdTech companies aren't always thinking about, what happens 3 stages after my product is deployed in schools, how is it implemented, what are the sort of second order effects of my technology. And what we really wanted to encourage was getting out of that fear and asking the questions so that you can have some answers you can act upon.
Okay.
Madison, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, when the question was asked, I was thinking actually more at the sort of the macro level and in society and what equity really means. And I think we see a lot of the disconnects even in development and artificial intelligence at large, because we're looking at I think the world really since 2020 is now starting to investigate a lot of systemic biases at the public zeitgeist level that didn't really happen before that in a way that is so intimate for us now. And so when you look at the way that technology is developed, particularly that of artificial intelligence, you're really looking at putting products on top of a system and a thought process that is inequitable, right? And that's just like the natural way that the world is operating. And so, yeah, I mean, my mind really went to, it kind of is how it is because the world isn't at that place yet. And so when you put other things on top of that, whether it be human beings, technology, et cetera, it just continues to exacerbate what is already existing. And we talk a lot about what that means in terms of artificial intelligence and data with people, especially when we're meeting with students and we're meeting with administrators and teachers and folks at the school level. We have a lot of a conversation around, why is this problem happening? And why are we seeing the same problems that we see happen somewhere else happening over here? And I think a lot about how we work to change the way that people see and equity and how it lives in each and every one of us, and what work we can do as an organization to help instill that thought process in individuals.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about that sort of zeitgeist level, because I think, and I want to bring Amelia in on this, because for me as a non-engineer, right, I look at this from almost as a practitioner. A lot of this kind of comes down to how thoughtful you are about the data that you use, which is your training data, to build the models that then get turned into product, right? That's my very simplistic view of this, right? And if you're not thoughtful about the data, then the product will clearly have, or will run the risk, at least, of having inherent bias, because you haven't thought about it. You haven't taken steps to mitigate it. Is that a fair comment, Amelia? Have I oversimplified that?
Not at all. I think it comes down to how do you know if your system works? And if your system works because you tested it, then that's great. But I think when people aren't very aware about equity, they'll say, well, you have a system and it only gets things wrong 2% of the time. And I know this because I built my system using very homogeneous data, and I tested my system using the same homogeneous data. And then I made this grand declaration that it works for everybody in the world. And people hearing this might go, oh, great, yeah, only breaks 2% of the time, fantastic. But then they start using it in reality. And you start seeing these things where for that 2% that was actually represented in the data, yeah, it's perfect. Or for all the, if the homogeneous data, it works perfect. But for everybody else, you see that it doesn't. And that's when you have to start getting creative and thinking about equity at every single stage of your system build. So obviously at SoapBox, we build voice technology, and that all starts with data. And from that very first step, you need to be thinking about, I'm building a model here. I'm building a system. The system isn't being told what to do. It's being shown examples of things and asked to come up with a model that then if you see an unknown one and match it to it, it will say it's this word or it's that word or it's this sound or that sound. And if you have only recorded, as your training set for your models, a certain amount of let's say accents and dialects, or just a certain kind of subset of the population of the world, it's only ever going to work for them. So you have to really start getting creative, and not only how to label your data, how to figure out what you've got and what you haven't got. And if you don't know, because, sometimes it is at odds with privacy, you need to come back to the original thing, which is, how do you know if your system works? You have to test it. So if you're not sure whether your system is going to work for speakers of African American English, you need to go and figure out a way of testing your system. If you can't be in the situation where you can label your data that's going into your models, you need to find different ways of getting as much diverse data as possible from as many different places as possible in order to maximize the potential of getting these diverse data points that will allow you to build a system that is equitable. And then when you test, you have to test with the right data, and only then can you make an assertion that, this only breaks 2% or 5% of the time, and I've tested it. And then, the next part is educating the community to stand up and go, but what did you test it on? And having that armor and having that, arsenal of questions to really stick it to the AI companies and hold them accountable for what they're building and what's going to get into education.
Yeah. So how much of this is about, in inverted commas, educating stakeholders within the market to ask the right questions? Because, it's not like as an AI company or a company that builds voice technology specifically for kids and mostly for use in education, like, we know that what we build is not witchcraft. It's not magic, right? It's a lot of hard work, and it's a very systematic approach to training models and then turning those models into products that kids can use, right? But there is a kind of like almost like a preconception out there in the market that this AI stuff is just too complicated. Let's not go there. We don't want to we don't want to go into the explanation of it because it's going to be too difficult. So maybe a lot of this is about just, removing some of that mystery and enabling stakeholders to have the confidence to be able to ask the right questions. Is that leading back to the kind of the toolkit and the certification and the socializing of that information? Is that one of the kind of core objectives, is to remove some of that mystery and to bring a greater level of visibility about this?
Yeah, you have that absolutely right, Martyn. I think that one of our theories for change was that can we simplify this in a way that doesn't take away the seriousness and the complexity of what Amelia was talking about. It is doing really hard work and putting in the investment in caring about this. And I think that, like you said, one of the ways that we get the industry to move is to make sure that the right stakeholders in education have a seat at the table. And for us, one way to do that was to start with equipping those leaders with just a couple of simple questions. Anyone can ask a question. Anyone can be curious. And especially if you kind of have the next step of, okay, once they answer my question, I have something I can do. I can look at this rubric and I can map what they said to red, yellow, green. It really, what we've seen in our experience is that it really helps sort of disarm the fears around and the high stakes feelings around those conversations to just get people talking. And, we find that once those conversations start, educators are the experts. They know the needs of their students. They've been championing the needs of their students for decades, centuries. And so we've, at least for me, it's been a source of optimism to see the way that those conversations can move the market.
Yeah, I was going to say, I like what you said about a source of optimism. And, Martyn, what you said about magic, I think I'm currently located in Oakland, California right now. So in the heart of Silicon Valley. And when I tell you that magic is the word that I see on every billboard driving from Oakland to San Francisco, if I had $1 for every time I saw that, I would be a very wealthy woman. I think that demystification is a huge piece of our ethos and our process in helping people find that agency. Nidhi spoke to educators and students. Students know the things that they need and that they want and what their lived experiences are. And when you sit down with a group of kids and you talk about artificial intelligence in a way, like you said, that demystifies what it really is and what it means for them, you see this unlocking not only in an interest to push back against systems and hold them accountable, but in an interest to be a part of those systems and to join in on designing and building those systems. And that's also really what we believe as the EdTech Equity Project as well. We believe that technology can solve problems, that it can move the world forward, that there is so many promises for technology, but we also see and want to speak and fight against the perils of what technology can present in the world. And those two things can be in the conversation together. It's not an either or conversation. It's how do we find progress, amongst, I think, ethos within the technology world, particularly that of the Silicon Valley, that is about perfection in product and really trying to push against that kind of ethos and thought process.
And do you think that's some of the issue here is that it's interesting when you talk about Silicon Valley and a lot of the products that come out of Silicon Valley that aren't necessarily to do with education. There's lots of other, markets out there. But in education, when you're using particularly these kind of AI technology, it's high stakes, right? It's high stakes from a point of view of, well, you can't afford to be giving the wrong answers to a child, right? Because it influences the outcomes, the educational outcomes that they might have, in addition to all of the other stuff around their confidence and so on. And do you think that that's part of the challenge here, is that there is a fear of going near this because it is such high stakes, or do you think that there's not a realization that it is high stakes? That's the bit I'm kind of going between the two as we're talking, and I'm trying to figure out which of those is it, because we know it's high stakes for lots of reasons, right? There's lots of inequity of access is high stakes in and of itself, right? As outside of just, getting scores wrong or assessments wrong, but inequity of access is high stakes in education, because you're dealing with kids and they're formative and they are, building, personalities and confidence about how they're going to look at the world. So they're being, formed as they're interacting with this technology. Whereas if I, as a 50-something-year-old white male, if Alexa doesn't understand the pizza that I'm ordering, it's not high stake. It doesn't matter, right? So is that the issue here? Is that it matters so much more?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of issues at play. I'll talk about, Nidhi, you probably have thoughts on what Martyn has said, but I think one side of it is really important to talk about is what are the incentives? What are the incentives that make companies design and develop in the way that they do? And we talk a lot about the funding landscape and how, the construction of the way that companies are incentivized monetarily to be in perfection, to be in fast and rapid development, to be in a space where they're not wrong. Yeah. And to what Amelia was talking about as an engineer and someone that designs technology, this process of this conversation of high stakes requires for someone that leads engineering teams like Amelia to say, we're great and good in all of these ways, but then here's ways that we're wrong. or that we need to do better, or that we don't have the right answer. And most engineers, I think, from the time that they get into computer science education all the way through when they might hit industry, are not taught to have that particular internal ethos on identifying where they miss the boat, right? Nobody wants to say, oh, hi, yeah, I built something that was racist and I want to do better, or I built something that was inequitable and I want to learn how to redesign it, because that means that you have to admit that you weren't the best of the best in the context of equity. And it's really hard, I think, for individuals, for product teams, and for organizations and companies to do that, because what is at stake is the incentive of the monetary offering to that company being taken away or reduced. And when you look at capitalism and all these things, on and on, it doesn't incentivize equity, an equity first mindset. And so I think that's definitely one of the issues. I think folks know it's high stakes, but they think, well, maybe what we're dealing with over here is even higher stakes than that. And that's really unfortunate that that's the conversation we have to have.
And I actually think that the knock-on effects of actually designing and considering with equity in mind actually are beneficial monetarily within a company, but people don't recognize it. So, for example, in the EdTech Equity Toolkit, one of the things that we found very helpful was to keep an assumption log, which is pretty much when you get your engineers and your product designers to all sit around and say, I assume this, so that's why we built it this way. And like the stuff people assume, the stuff we all assume every day is, we write it down, and when we see it there in black and white, we're like, but we never considered what if that's not the case? What if we did it a different way? And it's very, like, you're not going to sit down and solve all your problems in one go, but the knock-on effects for the company and for the industry are that you get different parts of an organization that are frequently siloed, all sitting together and discussing how to make a better product, and one that is more inclusive, one that is more intuitive, and it has a knock-on effect of just being an all-around better product, a better functioning company, better relations within the company. And I think it has a net positive effect in many, many different areas.
I was just going to add one thing that what Amelia said made me think of, which is, which high stakes are we talking about when we consider high stakes? So there's the value you might be leaving on the table. There's the stakes, of course, of being wrong that Madison talked about that I think paralyze many folks in the industry. And then there's the high stakes of what if we don't do anything? What if we don't look? And what I love about this conversation, and I think SoapBox Labs is modeling so well for the industry, is making it feel okay to look and to see what we find out, and then have an ecosystem of folks who are available to help you take the next step once you write those things down, once you test and you find out what you need to work on.
When we had the roundtable last week, and Vic mentioned right at the beginning around intentionality, and I think intent is something that's so important in this. Like if you can't establish intent at the outset, it's the whole sort of house of cards kind of falls apart. Like from our perspective, from a product design perspective, if you don't have that intent from the outset, it's not good enough to say, okay, well, we built something, let's see now if it works, as Amelia said, right? You have to have the intent at the outset to be able to say, right, okay, well, we're gonna do everything that we possibly can at every level within the organization, from the product processes that we have right through to the culture of the individuals who work in the organization, to mitigate against these issues. And that I think is the fundamental sort of core to this, and the principle that everybody ought to be working towards. I know that we talked a little bit about some specifics last week as well, around the rubric itself, in terms of the sort of detail and how you assess kind of edtech companies, and going back to that point about intentionality, how do you measure their intentionality? Maybe talk a little bit about that and get into some of the detail around the rubric itself, but also I think, the conversation we had last week around, the describe the picture exercise. I think that's really relevant to this part of the discussion.
Yeah, I was going to say this could be a good opportunity for us, Nidhi, to talk through that. When we say high stakes, I think in theory, people understand we don't want to harm students, but what does that look like in terms of artificial intelligence happening in the classroom to kind of find some of the current issues that we see, and then transition into when you're building products in an equitable way, like Amelia's team and the team at SoapBox Labs, and you all working together to think about what things look like at the outset for equity, kind of how you see the difference between those two sort of theories of thought or design and development. So Nidhi, I don't know if you want to talk through kind of the ways that we see AI playing out in a negative way in terms of high stakes for particularly that students of color. I'll just say really quickly, if you go on to Google and type in, racial bias and artificial intelligence, you're going to see a lot of issues in that regard across many industries and usages of AI outside of education, right? So we have seen this problem happening and existing in the world really since many aspects, particularly that of machine learning and other deeper level formulations of AI have come into the space to do specific things, identify a person's face, look at the way that someone answers a questionnaire in a criminal justice system and, rate whether they will come to court or not. I mean, there's so many ways that artificial intelligence is being used that are really problematic. So I think it's important to know that this isn't just an issue that finds its way in education, that this kind of larger issue at play, it's important for us as folks that care about the high stakes of students, how we look at problems in the industry and other places and how we might learn from that and sort of try to get ahead of that and be proactive in that sense. So Nidhi, if you want to talk about some things in education, that would be amazing.
To add to what Madison, just the way that you laid out the framework, I think it's really important to remember when we have this conversation, just even the environment that we put technology into in the education space. So we know that there is a history of systemic racism that does find its way into education data, even before we start talking about artificial intelligence. We have students who have been tracked into different levels of ambitiousness. When you think about students who have been put into advanced classes versus standards classes, we have a history in the United States, at least, of Black and Brown students being suspended at much higher rates than students of other races, white, including Asian. And you find that data, then it gets used in the way that we make assumptions about how students are doing, about what education should look like. And there's no reason for us to believe that the same sort of reflection of systemic racism finds itself in the data that then companies would use if they don't have, as Martyn, you mentioned, that intention from the start to really look for that and account for it before starting to build your products. And so some examples of what we see, it really can find its way into all elements of the education system. So you can think about tools that are being used to help teachers proactively manage the classroom better, and so might proactively identify students that are likely to have behavioral issues, but leaning on the history of what teachers have already written up students for. And oftentimes those technologies are used in schools to then deploy police in certain campuses or certain areas of the school. And so we see that perpetuating this perpetual cycle of over-policing Black and Brown communities. With personalized learning software of any kind, you can imagine we have this conversation that has been growing around culturally relevant content and asking ourselves, are we using examples that resonate with students? Are we using examples that students can understand? But then you often have, for example, when you're teaching a math concept around distance and rate and speed, we use examples of boats and swimming in the ocean against a current. And if students have never swam in the ocean, or have never gone swimming, they're not going to be able to articulate their understanding of that mathematical concept. And so when you sort of fast forward, a technology using AI may learn that the student doesn't understand those mathematical concepts and put them on a slower learning trajectory. And then, I think, Amelia, you can probably speak to some of what you think about that's top of mind for you. But with voice-enabled technology, we often have challenges around dialects that students might speak or accents, and the technology not being designed for that, and then assuming that a student has a lower level of reading or language comprehension skills.
Absolutely. And again, it all kind of comes back to, first of all, building out the system to try and mitigate against that. And the second thing is testing it properly. And one of the things that we found quite a lot in testing our system is that we like to test use cases where speech recognition is used by children in the classroom. And a lot of that, one of the things that we realized was a lot of those are passages being read by kids that have been written a long, long time ago, and are possibly not culturally relevant, possibly not linguistically relevant for a lot of children who wouldn't speak in the dialect in which it was written. So if you take an African American English speaker, they might speak very differently at home with their families compared to how they may do in school, or especially when they're reading words written not in African American English. So we have a situation then where we may think we're testing our system. If we have African American children reading this passage, which was written by a white person 50 years ago, they are going to switch into that dialect, and they're going to read the dialect, and they're going to read it perfectly and it will be fine. And now it would be a mistake for us to say, well, that means our system works perfectly for African American English. It doesn't. It works perfectly for general American English, or whatever you want to call it, regardless of who is reading it. And that's a different thing. So one of the things that we make sure to test in our system is when we're dealing with Latino English, African American English, any of the other accents, dialects, and in English, we make sure that the children speaking have had a chance to speak in their own dialect in the same way that they would if they were speaking at home to their parents, to their siblings. And in order to elicit that kind of speech, in order to test it, we have had to come up with a few little tricks, basically. So instead of asking the child to read a passage, we show them a picture and we ask them to describe it. So, you do get varying results. Some people just say, I see a tree, I see a car, but, other ones, they start talking about what they see and what it reminds them of, and some stuff that happened related to it. And that's how you really, really capture the way people speak. And that's how you really, really test a system. And I think that level of kind of sitting down and ruminating over the problem and actually really figuring out if you're testing the right thing, it's very important when you're building out these technologies and making sure they work properly.
I think I probably tell someone about describe the picture at least once a week. In just a conversation about when companies say, well, how do we start? How do we get there? How do we make, and really what's so amazing about what you said is that kind of switch to gather data isn't this like huge overhauling of engineering to get the correct data. It's literally just, we're going to show in picture instead of have a young, I think as a Black woman growing up in public schools, instead of having me read some like Shakespeare or something, right? Or whatever that like is, and there's many conversations about when classrooms don't have culturally relevant content and children are, for the sake of safety, for the sake of feeling integrated, for the sake of all of those things, they are learning that process of code switching. And then they would come into this process and that would be reinforced, right? And SoapBox Labs is saying, no, we don't want to reinforce what the existing systems are. We want to create a new kind of system. Mm-hmm. And that switch is such a simple thing to do. It's a deep thing to think about, but such a simple thing to do. Yeah, we're not going to just have people read words that didn't belong to them. We're going to let them use their own words mm-hmm. and the own ways that they use those words to describe what they see. And then we're going to use that. And it's so simple, but it's so deep at the same time to give a student that agency over their language and over how they express themselves is so wonderful. And so I love to tell people about that one small piece of the long process that you all went through. And I'm sure we need to talk more about, what did it feel like for SoapBox Labs to go through this process and to think through all of these things?
Because I think a lot, Amelia, I just want to say something as well. I think we like to think of ourselves as, we're very thoughtful about how we apply this technology, and we try to be as thoughtful as we possibly can. But a lot of that is actually also about being open-minded and questioning. As Amelia said earlier, that's often not a trait that is common to, I don't want to say engineers generally, but in terms of engineering AI systems or building these technologies, it's often overlooked, I think, or not mentioned, that it's okay to question that what you've built is not good enough, and you need to look at it again, and you need to be open-minded to think about, well, how are you testing this? Are you testing it in a way that is putting you in the place of the end user, whoever that might be, who's going to be using your products? Because you may be 5 or 6 steps away from that end user as the engineer, but you need to be thinking about how that end user is going to interact with your with the product that is integrating the technology that you have built. Sorry, Amelia.
No, that's great, and I think that from an engineering point of view, and actually talking about the kind of knock-on effects and the hidden benefits of thinking this way, is that if you ask any engineer, idealistically, they want to solve a cool problem. If you ask an engineer, hey, do you want to build a speech recognizer that only works in a very, very narrow framework and everyone has to pretend to speak an American accent in order for it to work? Everyone will go, no, that sounds brutal. Let's not do that. Instead, they want to build something that actually we want to unlock the the barrier between stuff and people. And if people can use their voice in whatever accent, whatever dialect, whatever way they speak that they want to, that's a cool research problem, being able to create a system that would allow that. So I think that being open-minded, being questioning, I think that once people are in that space, they're not being punished for having missed something, and you just have this kind of creative open thinking environment. I think everybody just has a better job satisfaction at the end of it.
Amelia, you mentioned something too that I think is critical, which is that we often see in the industry, when people do have the intention of wanting to support racial equity, this sort of abstract level of a CEO pledge, or where the leaders of a company say, we care about racial equity. But this is really what you're talking about, is the work to get to really shift the culture of your internal team, of the engineers who are doing the work, who actually make up the product. And that's harder, but also really yields the type of change that we are hoping to see.
That's great, yeah.
And I also think those examples are so powerful. Like Madison, you were saying, like you used the describe the picture example a lot. Like if you can find really powerful examples of how to think differently about this, if you are not intentionally doing it already, it also makes it so much more achievable in many ways, because you're kind of that's not complicated. Right? Changing the way you think about content and whether that content is culturally appropriate, that's not a complicated thing to do. If you can give people examples, then I think it helps them to get there much more quickly.
And Amelia talked about the assumptions log. A lot of times we sit down with product teams, we're not sitting down with product teams that are adversarial to equity. They're not coming into the conversation like, explain to us why we should develop things that help Black and Brown students in schools. They want to do it, but they do come to the table with this kind of, eyes wide open, like, oh my gosh, this is going to be really hard and super rigorous. And there's pieces of it and parts of it that will, right? When you get into really deep technical things, of course, there's going to be a lot to work through. But at the onset, it's amazing to just ask a question to a product team that's as simple as, did you all write down why you think the product is going to work? And then did you all write down why that might not be true? And everyone goes, oh no, I don't think we did that. Let's do that. And then we sit there for an hour and we do that. And everyone goes, wow, that one thing that we thought was really going to work, it might not be that great. So maybe now we can spend the next hour talking about 7 different ways that we might do that one thing. Right. And it starts this conversation that becomes, the foundation for how the team starts to shift the culture in thought, but also in practice.
The EdTech Equity Toolkit in general, really, from the point of view of somebody who's kind of working through it and following it, it's so practical. And there are all just such little steps you can take that all build up to this whole way of thinking. But as you say, you just have to take that first step. And people do it all the time for, let's say, product design. They decide they're going to, do agile, or they decide they're going to do, people take this on board all the time. So why not just do it for equity too? It's much easier to sit down and start with these simple little things that you can change. And as you say, the culture then shifts and everybody gets on board. And I think you end up with a better product.
Let's move on a little bit to, maybe talk a little bit about school leaders and other stakeholders and how they interact with the rubric and the kind of questions they should be asking of providers of these kind of edtech solutions. You want to talk a bit about that?
So one of the things that we thought about really that's related to what Amelia said for edtech companies is that how do we make something that feels practical and accessible to school leaders who don't in their daily lives think about how technology is built, who don't maybe have the lingo or the vocabulary that might be the way we talk about artificial intelligence within a company or within the tech sector, but they know how their students are interacting with the products, and they know how the way that the products might say you were right or you were wrong impacts the students' motivation around learning. And so we wanted to use, again, that language to think about how do we bring educators and school leaders into the conversation? And some of the questions are really simple, and you just kind of have to switch on that curiosity and not worry about what happens next in the conversation. But they were simple, like, what sort of students did you test your product on? Who uses your product? What are some of the examples that are actually used in your product? And you start to have a conversation around, well, if the answer to that question isn't the type of students I have in my school, or aren't the type of students that I'm most worried about serving well in my school, then we have a problem. And so that's kind of the start. I'll kick it over to Madison to share a little bit, and I'll actually pull up the rubric so we can give an example of a couple of the questions.
Yeah, it's funny. I was pulling up the rubric as well. And, really it's kind of a workflow process, right? So at the very beginning, you're asking questions just simply about data. Like, is this company going to be using data? Yes or no? And you're like, okay, yes, they are. And a question as simple as, if a company says we're using all of this magical data and systems to process that data that's going to, create really fantastic outcomes in the classroom. And the educator says next, great, we love data. What kind of data are you using? And can you also tell us, when you choose that data, what is the system, like what pieces of that data is the system using to make a decision for students of color? Did you test that? And I would argue that lots of companies that are not like SoapBox would go, we probably should get a technical person on this call, not just the product marketing person who is, selling this product into the school district. And just having that kind of agency in the conversation, we have seen in our experience, school leaders, particularly those that are in the procurement arm, are really empowered to create a much stronger assessment of the products that they're thinking of bringing into the school system. But in a way that isn't super burdensome on them, right? We wanted to try to relieve the burden of a procurement officer within a school district being completely educated in artificial intelligence to be able to find products that will work for their students. And that's really the intention of this toolkit.
Yeah. And one thing I would add to that too is there's the burden of understanding how artificial intelligence works. And then there's the burden that we know procurement officers are under, educators are under, where they're thinking about 15 million other things that are urgent. There's no way that they can, become an expert in AI and then have time to have these conversations that might be going over their heads because technology companies are using words that aren't natural for school leaders, and then make sense of that and be able to be expected to make the right decision about which technologies have their students' best interests in mind as centered in the development process. And so, as Madison mentioned, what we tried to do kind of under the hood is say, okay, here's how standard normally companies build their products. Here are the practices that we hope companies have done to prioritize equity. And what do we expect them to be able to answer when a school is in conversation with them about those things that would give a procurement officer or a school leader the confidence that they need to know that this product is going to work well for their students. And so some of the questions we have are, like Madison mentioned, do you even know what data this company is using and how they plan to use it? And then once you get that step further, you can ask questions about their testing practices, et cetera. But one of the pieces that we tried to really pull out in the rubric is once the company has answered your question, we want you to consider how confident you are that you know how the technology works. If the answer is after the company answered it, I'm still not sure, then you have a problem. And part of that is that we're hoping that these types of conversations put some pressure on education companies to be able to be in that conversation, to understand their own technology well enough to be able to answer those questions in a way that a school procurement officer would get the answer that they need.
Yeah, we no longer want, it's a black box and it does a thing and it's perfect for you.
Yeah.
We want school leaders saying, we don't think so,
Yeah, and a tactical example of that is if a company can't explain to you what the algorithm or their technology is optimizing for when it uses the data that it collected, then there might be something wrong. It probably doesn't work well for your students if they can't explain that to you in a way that you feel comfortable with.
I'm interested to get your view on how much of that do you think is influenced by how we interact with AI as consumers and how we've been sort of conditioned to interact with AI as consumers. Because as consumers, we're kind of conditioned to make a trade-off in terms of, well, if the thing that I'm being presented with has utility, right, and it has benefit to me in my day-to-day life, then it's best not to ask any questions about what's actually happening in the background, because the utility will override anything to do with my data privacy or my fundamental rights or whatever that might be, right? How much of do you think, when you're dealing with people who are in a position then to make decisions about how to apply this technology in education, that they are somehow even unconsciously influenced by that conditioning that they've been experiencing as a consumer?
Very, very much so. I think you hit spot on to that trade-off that really discourage it. It kind of works in an effort to, whether intentional or not, to discourage us from asking those questions. And I think with respect to education technologies, what feels scary about that is the piece around who's making decisions for whom. And one of the things that we're hoping with these types of conversations to shift a bit is to get comfortable in that space of having agency, and to feel like it's okay to ask those questions and it's okay to not be an expert. And actually, you have a right to understand how the technology is working and what pieces of your data it's using. And one of the things that I'm actually both simultaneously terrified by and encouraged by is the sort of the way that generative AI is kind of taking our world by storm. When we think about the ways that students and families will interact in a year or two with things powered by GPT chat and new forms of AI that hopefully will be more ubiquitous and more accessible, but also have us getting more comfortable with interacting with it. And then being able to be curious about, well, how did that work? Like, what was that answer based off of? And what assumptions did it make? So that we have more of a conversation that doesn't feel like you just have to trade the utility for. Yeah. But one thing that reminded me of as well, and I'd love to know how SoapBox thinks about this, is the piece that we often, I think, is missed when we talk about racial bias and artificial intelligence, is actually the user experience component of how transparent our technologies are on the day-to-day when you're using it. You know, when a teacher is using technology in the classroom, do they know which decisions were made powered by the technology? Do they have the ability to override it? Do students have the ability to know, hey, I think I actually got that answer right. Maybe there was a mistake in the technology. And I'd be curious how SoapBox thinks about that as well.
It's something that we think about just from the product design point of view. And just as an ethos very early on in the company, we always said that, you know, we're working with models, and models give confidences. They don't say right or wrong. They say likelihood of it being this other than that. So when we built our product, we analyzed the speech audio and we returned the analysis of it in a set of data points. And some of these data points, for example, would be how confident our system was that the vowel spoken was E, for example. And we do that at the sentence level, the word level, right down to the phoneme level. But then that really enables the decision to be made by the teacher rather than us at the technology level. Because when a teacher sees this, if they see a child practicing isolated words over time and they see that systematically this child is making this one particular error, they can decide what that confidence score for that particular sound means to them. So maybe if the child is improving, they will go from quite a low confidence score to a slightly higher one. And that, 50-60% for this particular sound would be good for that child. As the teacher and the child know the context, and we don't know the context. All we could do is offer up the results and have that interpretation be done by the actual educator and the people using the technology. And they can choose to disregard it as well. Much in the same way, if you're using predictive text and the predictive text gets it wrong, you go back and change it. You don't say, I'm just going to send that text now because the technology said it was true. No, you use your own agency and, you change it. And that's something we build into our products to enable teachers to take or leave it, and just makes AI a useful tool rather than something that is foisted upon people and that they have to use and obey.
I think it's a really important principle, just generally, that we need to question the outputs of the technology itself, right? I think particularly in education, there is a danger that it's used to remove agency, and that's a dangerous path to go down, right? It's there as a tool, it's there as a complement, it's there as a time-saving device in some cases, but it's not there to replace in any way, the interaction that you would have with a teacher and the benefit that you get from that personal interaction with a teacher. I am conscious that we are at a time. We did have one more question, but maybe we can do that as an email or something around optimism for the future. But do you have time just to say what are you optimistic about in terms of AI? And I'll let you go, Nidhi, first, because I know you've got to run.
Sure. Thank you, Martyn. And I feel like we could have this conversation for many, many hours. And I actually would love to do that.
Well, actually, you need to come to Dublin and then we can have it in person. Let's do that.
Yes, that sounds perfect. One of the things I'm most optimistic about, I touched on this a little bit, was, and a little bit scared about as well, is the idea that if AI and these generative models are more open and accessible and kind of ubiquitous around us, that we would actually be able to have students and families become more sort of AI literate, and be able to be curious about and interact with and be familiar with the way these technologies work, so that they can have more agency to participate in these conversations. with respect to sort of a shorter time scale, I think I'm really optimistic about the type of leadership that SoapBox Labs is showcasing here, and the ability for these small steps, these tangible steps, to really shift the way that we work as a sort of multi-stakeholder ecosystem, thinking about this problem in a direction where, as Madison mentioned earlier, being wrong is okay, and we can make progress in this space to champion the needs of students who have been systemically marginalized for a very long time.
Madison, what are you optimistic about?
I'm optimistic about the conversation being so robust and finding its way in a more tangible way. I think when we started this work even 2 years ago, sometimes it felt like pulling teeth to get people to listen to what we had to say around the importance of bringing racial equity into the design and development process in a really tangible way, not in a way that's like, we're just going to solve for equity, and to them, the definition of equity would be data privacy, which is a super important piece of it. But I'm optimistic about the suite of equity being baked out, right? It's not just equity and it becomes a sort of performative term or performative practice, but the idea that people are starting to see the intersections and how important it is to look at all of those intersections. And I'm really optimistic about, I work with a lot of students of color in having fun conversations with them about AI, how does AI work? How can they get involved in the technology industry? And it's really exciting for me to see young Black students in particular that feel excited about becoming AI engineers themselves, and seeing not just the opportunity to be a part of the technology ecosystem, but I think the opportunity to change it and to move it forward and to push it further. And that curiosity, when you see that type of curiosity in someone, it's just so overwhelmingly inspiring. And so that's what keeps me hopeful in this work.
I suppose I'm optimistic now that we've figured out how to build AI systems, what we need to do, what we need to keep an eye on. I'm optimistic for when we can start using them en masse, and we know that they're fair, and we know that they're actually going to be helpful. So learning how to build in the way that's equitable and puts privacy first, etc. That is so important to get these working systems. But then, we're not doing it. That's not the end goal here. The end goal is to create tools that really, really work for everybody, and they work well. They, for example, save teachers time. So when a teacher is doing running records, instead of, having to listen to every single recording of every single child, they have software that's helpful, that will do a first pass for them, saving them hours and hours of their time. This is why we're building it. And I'm optimistic that we're getting to a place where we can ensure that the AI is fair and the AI is equitable, and we're empowering people to ask questions of the AI providers, so that they know that what they put in their product is going to actually be useful in the way that will be a time saver and will be a useful tool in education.